Welcome to Managing for Sustainability, and this is the main topic for Prior Learning Week 1. And the question is, what is sustainability? Well, first of all, hear what Tom DeLay, the Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust, has to say about sustainability in business. He says, the last 5 years have seen global attention fixed firmly on the financial crisis and economic recovery. But while this has been playing out, a far more fundamental risk to our long-term economic development has remained in the background. This is the rapidly expanding use of our scarce natural resources, combined with the planet's ability to cope with the multiple impacts of their use. In the year the financial crisis began, the world was already using resources at a rate 50% faster than it can renew. And as our growing population, expected to reach 9 billion by 2050, consumes more, these strains on our natural capital will become even more acute. The inevitable conclusion of this is a resource crunch. It means we urgently need to find new methods of production, address wasteful consumption, and develop innovative business models that put sustainability at the heart of business operations. But a recent survey of global business leaders shows that while awareness of the pending resource crunch is high, most businesses see this as a risk to be managed rather than as a new commercial opportunity. True leaders recognise this opportunity and take a deeper look at resource use to drive a far more fundamental business change. Well, that may be the business context looking forward, but let's look back now at the historical emergence of the concept of sustainability so that we can understand it better. Well, the image on this slide is one I remember well, and it gave us, living on planet Earth, a view of where we lived, the place we'd taken for granted, a completely new sense of perspective. It gave a new profound meaning the term spaceship Earth, which had already been coined in the 1950s. This was from the Apollo mission, looking back at the blue planet across space, just one of many places in the universe. Spaceship Earth, what it showed us was that the Earth systems are highly integrated and that there are limits. And beyond the atmosphere, there's nothing within our reach. In the guided study for this session, I've asked you to look at the International Institute for Sustainable Development timeline for sustainability and pick out some key waymarks in the developing world consensus on the need for environmental management in balance with social and economic development. So let's look at a few of those here. Starting in 1971, the OECD says those causing pollution should pay, and enabled the polluter pays principle to be established and accepted. 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment at Stockholm occurred. This key point, the Stockholm Conference, was rooted in the pollution and acid rain problems of Northern Europe. It led to the establishment of many national environmental protection agencies and the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP. Jumping to 1979, we saw the World Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution. And as this was adopted, it showed a change point where the world together recognised our common responsibility to tackle world issues in Spaceship Earth together. Then we get to 1983 for the Brundtland Commission, which was created to address growing concern, quote, about the accelerating deterioration of the human environment and natural resources and the consequences of that deterioration for economic and social development. Prior to this, the prevalent environmental agenda adopted by nations was environmental protection, but this tackled only the symptoms of environmental degradation. It ignored the sources. The sources were to be found not in our air, soil and waters, which were the focus of the environmental protection agenda, but in the whole range of perverse public policies, especially our dominant fiscal and tax policies, our energy policies, and our trade, industry, agriculture, and other policies. The lead author of the Brundtland report reflected on this in 2013 and wrote, "In 1972 at Stockholm, we all in effect took a huge aspirin to treat the symptoms of our environmental headaches and feel better, at least temporarily. But we did nothing to address the causes of our multiple and growing environmental maladies." Out of the Brundtland Report, a massive shift took place that changed the landscape from politically safe environmental protection to the much more politically demanding sustainability agenda, requiring new policies to tackle root causes, committing governments to targets, not just offloading responsibility to companies to clean up their acts. Sustainable development was born. Moving on to 1987, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer is adopted. May not sound very thrilling, but within 2 years from the science giving a clear view on the causes of ozone layer depletion, international agreement was reached on difficult actions to tackle it. 1992 was the Earth Summit, the UN Conference on Environment and Development, which was held in Rio. The largest political summit in history. International agreements were reached on the action plan called Agenda 21 and others. 2 Rio conventions were opened for signature, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Moving on to 1995, the World Summit for Social Development is held in Copenhagen. It's the first time the international community has expressed a clear commitment to eradicating absolute poverty. 1999, the launch of the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices, the first of their kind. The tool provides guidance to investors looking for profitable companies that follow sustainable development principles. 2005, Kyoto Protocol enters into force. Legally binding targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions are set. The same year, Walmart launches its global sustainability strategy. One of the world's leading retail companies commits to be supplied 100% by renewable energy, create zero waste, and sell products that sustain people and the environment. The strategy begins to transform Walmart's global supply chain and sets an example for other multinationals to follow. The next year, 2006, a Stern review makes a convincing economic case that the costs of inaction on climate change will be up to 20 times greater than measures required to address the issues today. In 2008, world fuel, food and financial crises converge. Global food prices increased 43% in 1 year. Growing energy demand in China, India and elsewhere sends energy prices soaring. Financial institutions falter over the collapse of mortgage lending in the United States, and markets tumble, sending the world into recession. Well, let's look at some definitions of sustainable development. The first one comes from what is called the intergenerational equity focus, and it comes from the Brundtland Report, and this one is the one most often quoted. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The lead author has recently said about this definition, intergenerational equity is obviously an important feature of any viable definition of sustainability, but standing alone to the exclusion of others, it doesn't make sense, not in today's world. It was clear even in 1987 that the world's economic systems had become totally interlocked with the Earth's ecological systems. If we were to maintain a habitable planet for our species, we would soon have no choice but to begin to live within nature's limits, keeping consumption at levels that are within the bounds of ecologically possible. Other definitions of sustainable development embody the concepts of needs, such as the availability of affordable resources, justice in access to them, particularly in relation to the world's poor, and the idea of nature's limits to meet needs imposed by the state of technology or limits imposed by the social organisation or the condition of ecosystem services. And sustainable development embodies the interconnectedness and complexity of systems supporting human well-being across space and time, which echoes back to Spaceship Earth. So, in summary, sustainable development is about consumption standards. It's not in the long run sustainable development if we have consumption patterns that others cannot aspire to or that are not within ecological limits. There's also another focus in sustainable development. It's about balance. It's an approach to development that looks to balance different and often competing needs against an awareness of the environmental, social, and economic limitations we face as a society. So that balancing, for example, may be livelihoods for fishermen versus fish stocks that may be dwindling. The balance may be to provide reservoirs for water versus wildlife, human settlement and livelihood that might be removed by them. So we need to bring in specific reference to wider factors in dynamic balance. The Sustainable Development Commission, which is now closed, emphasised the need to find a balance between limitations beyond the environment. So we have environmental, social and economic factors. And under the environmental ones, we need to protect the quality of the environment. We need to protect ecosystem services like flood defence, the carrying capacity of the environment and resource supply. Under the social heading of sustainable development, we need strong, healthy and just societies. We need diversity, cohesion, inclusion and equal opportunity. Without those, any degree of technological improvement just won't work. And we need economic security, prosperity and equity. And all of those need to be balanced to have true sustainable development. So what are the challenges of these three factors we have to hold in balance? Well, under the environmental factor, we have to ease the looming shortages of critical resources such as oil, water and food. Under the social heading, world development seeks to mitigate poverty, strengthen social justice and enhance human well-being. And to have a sustainable economy, we need more effective transnational governance to regulate globalising markets in capital, finance and products. So that was a lot of words, but let's see what we pull out of that as sustainability as a concept. It's more than eco-efficiency. It's a broad and challenging ethical concept. It embodies ideas of justice and responsibility before self-interest. Sustainable development stretches across the generations. It builds on principles such as the polluter pays. And there is an emerging consensus among leaders that it is the right thing to do. So let's look at some of those depleting resources. The developed world is powered by oil. The food system is utterly dependent on it. Some predictions expect oil production to cease by 2057. Others don't. So when oil runs out, or at least peaks and starts to decline, what will the price be then? The UK Energy Research Report, Global Oil Depletion, an assessment of the evidence for a near-term peak in global oil production, concludes with this statement. On the basis of current evidence, we suggest that a peak of conventional oil production before 2030 appears likely, and there is a significant risk of a peak before 2020. Given the lead times required to both develop substitute fuels and improve energy efficiency, this risk needs to be given serious consideration. So moving from resources to a new concept called planetary boundaries, which is used for estimating a safe operating space for humanity with respect to the functioning of the Earth's systems. Now, this concept identifies 9 key Earth systems. On the diagram, the inner green shading represents the proposed safe operating space for these 9 planetary systems. The red wedges radiating out represent an estimate of the current position for each of those 9 variables. The boundaries in 3 systems have already been exceeded, and these are the rate of biodiversity loss, climate change, and human interference with the nitrogen cycle. So clearly, to operate sustainably, we need to be within the green boundary. Sustainability is also fundamentally about values. Here's one of my favourite quotes. Every environmental issue begins as a scientific problem and ends as an ethical one. As the CEO of Sky has said, we're committed to doing the right thing. Ultimately, society must decide the values it works to. Businesses have the option to choose to do the right thing or to continue business as usual. But ultimately, society will compel change by regulation when there is a consensus about what the right thing is. The right thing to do is sometimes a difficult balance to find. Think about this example. Extreme weather events and the human suffering they cause are increasingly being linked to climate change. To mitigate climate change, we can reduce the use of fossil fuel-based vehicle fuels. Biodiesel is a technical solution, but in some places leads to tropical rainforest destruction and biodiversity loss, or more widely, reduced food production when land is converted to oil palm plantations. What is the right thing to do? Let's look at leadership. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. The companies leading the way in sustainability are helping to show that it is possible to hope that there are things we can do to make a future that will last. Without them, we can all look miserable and convince ourselves that there's no point being creative, courageous, and innovative. Pursuing sustainability makes good business sense for these business leaders. In the guided study, you will read what is needed to make the great transition to a sustainable world. To reach this world requires business and all society to act with hope. As they say, the great transition can only emerge as a collective cultural and political project of global citizens, a development that is far from guaranteed. You'll see this discussed more in the guided study for this session. So what are the next steps after seeing this podcast? We'll go onto Blackboard and locate the instructions for the guided study for Prior Learning Week 1. And when you've done that, commence the Week 2 work.